Restorying the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubenstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restory the culture together.
Hi, welcome to episode 3 with Tanya and Camille, Restorying the Culture. Today we're going to be talking about how we restory healing. And I'd like to share with you a quote first by Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Kramer in the book Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth. Life must be properly nourished and cared for before it can take root and begin to be differentiated. And we'll start by asking you, Tanya, how are you restoring healing in your work?
Thank you, Camille. It's funny because I never thought when I was starting out in any way that healing, first of all, it was not something that interested me, which is amazing because my whole career and life and work now I feel is defined as a story worker, as a writing coach, solo performance coach, helping people extract their stories. My work has evolved into something completely of a healing nature. And for many years, I didn't even want to come out of the closet about that. I thought it would somehow diminish my credibility as a quote unquote real artist. What I've learned is that real art is ultimately about transformation. As a matter of fact, there are two kinds of stories that I've identified. And one is a toxic story, actually. And people don't think of storytelling can be toxic, but I'll explain in a moment. And one is a healing story, a transformational story. It's also the highest form of artistry to me, is to go to the transcendent. So one thing I have learned as somebody who works with people so deeply on their personal narratives around one person shows and memoirs is the shadow of this kind of story work is self-indulgence from the ego, or actually getting more attached to the victim story, or the story, mostly the victim story, and the trauma story, and reinforcing it by telling the story over and over and over. And interestingly, I had one client who was really an amazing client, but and very talented comedian, improvisational actor, but he was telling a very deep trauma story. And what I started to realize was that rather than the story moving to a place of transcendence for him, he was getting really attached to doing it over and over and over and over. And I saw he was re-traumatizing himself. And he was also getting validation from the audience as a victim. So this is real tricky, nuanced shadow stuff. And many story workers and writing coaches, and people who work with people on their books like I do, but I know a lot of people in the literary world, other story coaches, writing coaches, they don't quite know how to work with this. And I mean, I've been working with this for a long time, but it's like behind the scenes, we all know it, but it's hard to identify it because it can be hard to verbalize it and help people move past it. Because there's almost like this sacred thing around story where it's untouchable. But the reality is it's all about the framework in which story is held. And some years ago, I knew that I had to do something about this myself so that I could find a way to language with my clients what to do if I, as their facilitator, which really means I was holding space as a healer for them, to move through the story without looping on the trauma story to the point that it became their identification. Now, the other type of story, and the story in my work that I'm always working to move people towards, is the story where they're actually telling the story not for the sake of the story itself, but to release an identity, to release trauma, to release, in some ways, their own perspective, where they've gotten locked in on story, to live into the mystery, to open to the unknown, to live into a more expansive story for themselves. And when they do that, they're actually modeling that to the reader, to the audience, to whomever they're serving them with their story. Because when we do tell a story, I feel, yeah, a lot of my work is about the responsibility of telling stories and how they're held, because stories can re-traumatize, and it doesn't mean there's not a place for the big breaking open, but how one is presenting it, right? Especially as a work of art, as a solo show, as a whatever. And one story brings us closer, and one actually locks people either more into egoic identity or even pushes people away from them. That's also a danger when somebody's stuck in a victim story, or what can be read as self-indulgent. They're doing it to achieve more intimacy, but what happens instead is they push others away.
Well, as I was listening to you talk, I was taken immediately to the number of clients that we've shared and how we've talked about how our work together is going beneath the story, right? It's about finding the story under the story, and that's where the healing and transformation take place. And it actually is taking me back to the quote I shared that has to do with that life must be properly nourished and cared for before it can take root and begin to be differentiated. So there's a paradox here where oftentimes I think the stories that we tell are not healing stories, because in order to differentiate, we have to tap into our root system. And a lot of stories take us away from our root system. So I guess what I'd like to say is that in my work, I find sometimes an over-identification with the concept of healing and a lack of connection and nurturing to the life that was passed on to us through our lineage, and that it's the it's the going low and going slow that helps us to reconnect to where we came from, that I think helps us sort of release even sometimes what I would think of as like the panic around our story and our healing, right? Like that somehow that we're not okay just as we are, or that we're not able to be vulnerable enough to um, to have the people behind us who pass life on to us, parents, grandparents, and ancestors, like with all that it cost them and with all that it cost us for life to be passed on. And so I've developed something called systemic relational health. It's a framework that it's really not new. It's my language that I'm ascribing to concepts that are very old. So I just want to say that. And I think of a spider web, and any system is like a web. You touch one part of the system and it's felt by all other parts of the system. So really our work is looking at the relationships between the things in the web, and really understanding that we are relational beings, that we are organisms that are part of a greater organism. And how do we come into greater conscious awareness around the things that drive us in life, the things that influence us? And I think, it's about, for me, healing now has more to do with consciousness than anything else. And I go, and that actually takes me, it's funny how we come full circle, right? So it takes me back 20 years to when I started working in hospice as a nurse and making documentary films around death and dying. And I remember having one of those big aha moments when I realized that some of the most significant healing I was experiencing was the healing of dying people. And just to see that health and illness are on a continuum, but they don't define who we are as people. That healing can happen in any bodily condition, and that it's not just about the body. right? Healing is multidimensional, and I think the more conscious we become of ourselves as multidimensional beings, the more we can see that the body is a part of that, but it isn't the whole story. How have you restored healing in yourself?
Well, one thing I wanted to say as a story worker is, and including myself as a story worker, as a performing artist, as a writer, and ways I've worked with story as well as healing and how they've interrelated in my own life. But one thing, just going back a minute, I wanted to say all stories, in my experience, must be welcome. Like that there's a sense of belonging around stories, and that it's appropriate developmentally. And I could say this in my own experience with truth, of like really leaning into being an intimate storyteller, like my mentor, the late Spalding Gray, who I always honor in my work, because I wouldn't have had a path or modeling without my early 19-year-old meeting of him and seeing his work and meeting him. He was close with a college professor of mine. But anyway, so there were times, because I didn't want my earlier stuff to sound a little judgmental, there's a time when it's almost appropriate for us to acknowledge our victim story, right? It's very important to developmentally move like through these different layers of story. I needed to do that. There was a time I just needed to speak out, and most people do, our rage, our anger. If there's been a perpetration in our family, if there's been a trauma in our own lives, our disappointment, our fragility, our fear of meeting life. But when we get in lockdown with them is the problem. So I want to say that the expression of them is never the problem. And developmentally, we move individually and culturally. Like the Me Too movement, I see as a very important turning moment in the story for a certain kind of woman's rage that I certainly relate to come out. But it's not the end of the story. That's when it gets tricky, when we think these movements or even our own stories are the end. One of the things I think about story work is, like enlightenment, it's not a finite process. When I was young, I thought, oh, enlightenment was static. Awakening was static. Consciousness, there was an end point in one time. And, we're given these sort of guru stories, right? We get there. Part of my own story has been to let go of that guru model, understanding that authority on the outside is simply another illusion in many ways to me. Each person, to me, we have the ability to awaken inside ourselves, and we have the ability to work with story inside of ourselves. And the key, right, and the trick is not getting attached, allowing one and expressing and continuing to move, to go deeper, 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 to sink deeper into our relationship with our stories, our bigger stories. And that's been so the movement of my soul over to use a constellation phrase, over the last, let's see, 25 years since I did my first one-woman show. And I had such a passion for that. And I always say to people, to my clients and people working with purpose, to move towards your passion, your desire. I had such a heart's desire to do that show. And it opened up everything for me. And yet the key has been to do another show and another show, and then monologues, and move into my role as a mentor and coach, and continue to morph, not only in my professional life, but in my personal relationship to story, moving from doing a certain kind of therapeutic work, aligned with that, to doing a more quantum, what I would call work with the quantum field, with the ancestral work with you, with shamanic practices that I've imbued by my work with others in those fields. So it's like the story work of one's life, right? My tapestry of my story work has been to deepen and deepen and deepen and open the circle of belonging, rather than shut down in a moment in my life. And that is the danger of a single story, of a single moment, an attachment to it. The bigger story work is the opening the circle for ourselves, for our lives, for the world of stories. And last thing I want to say on that, for me, a lot of the personal work has been to let go of any idea of taboo or any idea of unspeakable. If we're human and it's happened, it's essential as part of our development with it in the restoring to be able to speak it and be heard in it. There's no story too taboo or too marginalized to have a place in this. The phrase that has come to me for decades is the global story circle. And that's what I've been working to create, a place of these circles expanding and what they can hold. And it's been my own path too, to hold, to just speak my life very intimately and transparently day to day, not just in formal settings of being on stage or writing a post on Facebook or something, but being willing to be intimate with my personal story in the moment has been my healing. And you, Camille, let's turn this on you in terms of your work, particularly with constellation work as well as systems work and your death and dying work. Like, what has been your personal journey and understanding on that journey, insights on that journey? What is your lean into healing and restoring your concept of healing over these last many decades? I've known you for the last two.
Well, it's funny, like I knew exactly where I was going to come into this conversation, but just having you ask the question, I think took me a little bit deeper. And what came up for me is sort of this awareness that I have now that the path to wholeness is to be allowing of where we're broken. And so for me, healing is in the way that you talk about story. For me, healing as a nurse and as somebody who's moving into the field of humanizing mental health care and Jungian psychology, I think I think that it is all about belonging. Like you and I are saying the same things and we're applying it in different ways. But in terms of kind of my healing story, I think I had to experience where I was different and unique before I could, in my family system, even before I could come back to being part of the family, which speaks to there are all of these different developmental stages that we go through, right? And so I've come back to feeling very much a part of my family system, but I had to feel like sort of an ugly duckling or sort of an odd one out for a while in order for me to sort of feel comfortable with being that and being connected. And I agree with you. I think part of lineage work in every way is not only naming our parents and our ancestors, but naming our teachers. And so I'd like to acknowledge Helen Newman, who was my teacher in family constellation work, and to Bert Hellinger and many of the others like Virginia Satir, who influenced the work, and the Zulu tribe in whatever ways they contributed to this work. I want to acknowledge that and how that was really a big part of my healing. After becoming a nurse, I would say that trusting my intuition has been part of my healing. I was given a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness, and it came on the heels of experiencing some extreme burnout and deep chronic stress, working as a hospice manager. I think at one point I was in charge of 60 people between two different offices in a system that was very dysfunctional, with a lot of heart and a lot of soul, but a lot of interrelational kinds of dysfunction. And it took a toll on me. And I was given instruction on how to handle this potentially life-threatening illness. And I just knew intuitively that wasn't the right way for me. And so I didn't see a healthcare provider, clinician, physician, nurse practitioner for 2 years. I pretty much just rested and did the work that I could do that was not harmful to me for that 2-year period. And I think that was it was like a restoration of something that needed to happen. And when I came out of it, then I went back into the system and I went to see a specialist who had been recommended to me. And when I went and saw the specialist, he just sort of looked at me and he said, "Oh, you don't have that." So that was interesting that I didn't have it all along, but I was told I had it, and it took me into, I mean, I literally got to the place where I was doing my death and dying work after being a hospice nurse and making documentary films on death and dying, and then being a hospice manager and coming up with my own the things that are sort of were erosive of my own healing, which were a lot of my unseen patterns about being a rescuer, about being a caregiver and overcaring and not taking care of myself in the ways I needed to, and how that has played out really in every relationship in my life. And so that's been a lot of my own healing work. And so yeah, really have to say I love what you said about belonging and about and I do think I can see that with you, that you're like a master of being able to hold any story from any person wherever, like you meet people where they're at. Like that's one of the things that the teaching in hospice work, and it's stayed with me in my work, is that we meet people where they're at. And when we can release judgment, I mean, I think judgment is one of the biggest enemies of healing.
Well, one of the things that comes immediately to mind that is about our relationship to each other, both of our work in the world, but and also our personal lives, is restoring um, culture to a more healing place. To me, I believe we'll start with circles of humans all over the world. I've had this vision, like it's one of those soul things in my mind's eye for 20 years since I started doing the work, and I would say it over and over. I see people in small circles on stages all over the world sharing their stories. And since then, I mean, you and I created some of that work together, but I see this going global. It's the small circles. I know I'm part of a beautiful online group my friend Perdita Finn runs, and her husband Clark Strand, The Way of the Rose, about the divine feminine and praying the rosary. And I'm not Catholic. I'm spiritual, but not in any framework. But I just want to say, people are coming on. We're seeing this as a movement. I have my own group. You and I are having a face group, but group. It like goes now beyond just the stages, right? So, but no matter where we are, the small circles of women, I think about, and just people. I have a history in 12-step programs, which is essentially a global story circle. And the monologue work of people sharing around a topic, coming together, not just related to addiction or codependency or any other pathology, but just to, or process, which has been very valuable. But we've brought together groups of people around cancer, hospice caregivers. One of the most meaningful things work I have ever experienced in my life was when we got to work with the Palestinian and Israeli and Arab Israeli girls who were brought all the way to New Mexico just so they could get in a circle together, because that wasn't safe or possible where they lived. So they had to come thousands of miles to come on a circle together. And I remember we put them up on stage together, sharing their stories. And here they were, 3 different groups, and this of course relates to global peace. It's like 3 different groups who came with all this fear of each other, othering of each other. Their families have othered each other. There's individual and collective trauma, and they're up on stage, right? You remember that, crying? And we'd gotten them each red roses, and they were up there with their roses, crying, holding hands, after being in the circle, sharing their stories in front of about 400 or 500 people together at the old Sweeney Center, and then at the temple too, holding hands, taking their vow, crying. They were one, and they were bound by stories. They each had the opportunity to be heard in their stories, and then they were there hearing each other's ancestral stories. They were there hearing each other's multi-generational stories, bearing witness, but each one of them got a voice. And from my life experience, the whole thing is bring people together in collaborations, in stories, to deeply listen and be heard be witnessed them by the audience, because something magical happens then, right? There's a bridge of compassion and awakening breaking open in each person who's not only sharing, but witnessing and bearing witness to these stories. So for me, restoring the culture means, restoring our healing work means listening deeply, taking the risk to be intimate, sharing stories and letting stories move through us into bigger and bigger circles of story. So that was what first came up, is this is the time of the circles of wisdom and stories coming together. Tell me from you what first came up, because I know there's so many ways into this in terms of restoring the culture around healing.
I think for me, restoring the culture, it's side by side. You and I have so many parallels, right? Like you have and mine's right next to it, and they're cousins or they're sisters or they're one, but they have different expressions, right? And so I think for me, restoring healing in the culture has to do with intimacy and connection. And I think there's also the voice of the voiceless. The feminine isn't always told in the story of the voice in language, because that's connected to the left hemisphere of the brain and the relational half of the brain. I mean, of course, they're connected. It's not just right, left, right? They have a relationship, fortunately, and I think I see circles of holding, like you see circles of stories. I see us being able to heal with each other through close contact, through like restoring our human nervous systems, and through close resonance with each other, and through close resonance with the highly sensitive relational fields that surround us, and really learning how to tune in. And just to say that when I talk about mother, father, and generational stuff, I also know that some people have stories that make that just feel completely unsafe and out of bounds. And I get that. And I totally embrace that and honor it. And I just want to say that there are ways to heal mother and father wounds without it being your mother and father. There are ways for us to get mother energy and to heal with one another through our nervous systems by, as my friend says, lending his nervous system. I love that phrase. And I just want to say that I feel like healing is about coming closer, not moving further away. And holding center. I think learning how to hold center in these turbulent times of big change and times of dissonance and crisis, it's like, can we lean in where it's a bit uncomfortable instead of pulling away and making the tension of opposites in our lives so taut that we become isolated, and not just from others. That isolation happens inside, that we actually reinforce the internal splits within us. And I think we're really being called right now to soften, whether that's softening through a dying practice, which doesn't mean you're necessarily dying. It means that you understand that one day you will die. And it's, like Stephen Levine's book, A Year to Live. If we all synced up with the fact that we had a year to live, how would life change for us? Those are questions, those are really helpful practices that, even though they're called dying practices, they really are living practices. Those are the practices that reinforce living. And for me, healing is about coming into these human lives before we die. Are we allowed to be fully human and fully connected as a human being before we die? So that means we're not always so overly identified with the world outside of us that we don't get to come into our vulnerability. Are we able to not do spiritual bypass and just identify with archetypes outside of ourselves and be led around in ways that we're not conscious of, that take us out of our humanity? All of these things about how can we become human before we die. I guess for me, that's the ultimate healing. Tanya, are you going to give some writing prompts now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually just, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And one of the things Camille and I are just sort of playing with, and things may change and morph a little as we're just starting this, and our but committed to showing up on these podcasts for a time being. We're playing around with ideas of really supporting you, because we're really both facilitators as well as mentors and speakers and writers and all the things we do. To have an interactive process where we're actually offering a writing, and you may perhaps want and Camille will be doing meditations as well, and we'll decide if we're doing it every week or one of each every week. We're going to try both today, but for you to start a journal perhaps around restoring your life here. And you can, in the journal, you're invited to do the weekly prompts or writing portals to begin to restory your own, and through the writing, see what wants to bubble up, your own story, your own wisdom, your own healing. So we're going to start that today in this one. So related to your own healing, and I want to honor another one of my mentors and teachers, Natalie Goldberg, who wrote Writing Down the Bones, is here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and actually worked with some of the young women with us on that exact project with the Palestinian and Arab-Israeli young women I was speaking of, and came and helped us facilitate. But Natalie has written many, many amazing books on writing, and her classic is Writing Down the Bones. So the way I work with people when you're journaling or free writing is through Natalie's sort of lens and guidelines, which is, you may already do this, but it's important because to not do this on a computer, because it actually uses a different part of the brain. This is getting really rooted with your intimate self, your writing voice, by just pen and paper. So the premise of free write is to just basically do a timed writing and keep your hand moving no matter what. Okay, so I'm going to give you two prompts actually. One is a topic, and the other one is going to be a kind of an inquiry. And if you want to time it and just keep your hand moving for 5 minutes to start, that's great. If you want to do 20 minutes, you just decide. But the timer is important because it keeps you safe by yourself in a container. So because this really is an exercise of letting yourself go deep, but then safely bringing yourself out. So the first prompt that you may want to write on, if this speaks to you, is what story is getting my attention now? What story is getting my attention now? And you can just write on that. And another one is, and it actually is combining the last two podcasts, this one and the one before, my body. And just letting yourself go, whether 5 minutes or 20 minutes, those as the two topics, one an inquiry and one just a free write on the story that wants to reveal itself. And Camille, are you going to close us out now with a meditation?
Sure. So again, this is going to be really brief, but it's something that you can take with you. And what I'd like you to do is close your eyes. And I'd like you to focus and find the place of least resistance within your body and rest there. And allow the natural breath to move in and out of your body. And just notice how we don't have to think about our breath. It happens even when we sleep, like the tides of the ocean and the waves that move in and out. And I'd like you to imagine a river that flows at the pace of your life. And beneath this river is the slow river, the river beneath the river that I use in my work. And this river moves at the pace of your soul. And I'd like you to just stand next to this river beneath the river and really allow your body and your nervous system to feel that pace. And when we sync ourselves up with the river beneath the river, we sync ourselves up with the naturalness of our being, and with nature herself. And we find that everything that needs to happen happens. There's plenty of time. Because here we come into ourselves in a way where we are inside our own medicine. And just allow yourself to do this when you feel yourself speeding up or feeling anxious and worried. Bring yourself to the river beneath the river. Thank you.
It was beautiful. Thank you, everybody, for sharing with us this week and just acknowledging my dear friend Camille for her beauty and wisdom here. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you, Camille.
Thank you. I feel exactly the same way. All right.
And love to everybody. So much love and
So
to
much
be
love.
continued.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restorying the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restorying the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.